Well, I think we are going to get started. Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. My name is Brian Min. I teach in the political science department here at Michigan. And I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this meeting. It's been a really thought-provoking set of sessions so far. And I'm really excited about this upcoming panel right now, where we have a really nice set of papers that explore how the type of political regime affects the ways in which states govern. And so we have a set of papers that look at it from a number of different cases, a cross-national study that compares democracies and autocracies, a study in Angola, a case of an autocracy, in Ghana, a case of a country that has transitioned to democracy, and Detroit, which I guess is an example of a transition from democracy to autocracy. So with that, we'll get started. Our first paper today is, our presenters are Rod Alence and Alecia Ndlovu.
Okay, thank you. The title of the paper is Why Some African Countries Are Better Governed Than Others, and this paper has come out of some earlier work that I did on governance quality in Africa and some earlier work that Alecia did for her MA thesis at WITS. And we'll be sharing the presentation, so we'll be kind of going up and down a little bit. The background to the paper is this idea that bad governance is often put forward as an explanation for why African economies have had disappointing performance over the past few decades. But one of the things that's neglected by that kind of an explanation is the fact that governance quality varies quite dramatically within sub-Saharan Africa from country to country. So what we're going to be trying to do is to assess some explanations of why we see that kind of variation in governance quality. The key outcome that we'll be looking at is something that we call developmental governance, which kind of loosely speaking is the performance of the state as an agent of social and economic development. So what is the ability of the state to play that role? And so we look essentially at the extent to which the state can pursue in an organized way socially desirable objectives without major interference from sectional political interests and sort of corruption through the private misuse of public resources and authority. And we think of that as a scale from, well, we put it on a scale from 0 to 10, so it's possible to have a very low level of developmental governance, which means the state behaves in a kind of predatory or ineffective way, versus developmental governance at the high end, which is where the state carries out these functions well. One thing we don't mean by developmental governance is necessarily democracy or anything specific about the political rules of the game. We treat the relationship between democracy, whether you have free and fair elections that meet minimum standards of competitiveness and openness, we treat that as something that may or may not affect the quality of governance, but we see it as analytically distinct. So when we talk about good governance, we're not talking about democracy per se, we're talking about the role of the state in development, and then we'll be looking at whether democracy helps or hinders that. The methods, we use cross-national data for 44 sub-Saharan African countries, and I'll be using Africa and African as a shorthand for sub-Saharan Africa, but we're focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. And we've got all countries in the region with population over, I think, about 500,000 are in the sample. Moving down, I mentioned that that there's been this tendency to blame bad governance for disappointing development outcomes in sub-Saharan Africa. This slide kind of quotes the sort of opening shot in that whole way of looking at Africa's problems of development from the World Bank's Sub-Saharan Africa from Crisis to Sustainable Growth report that came out in second half of 1989, I believe, where they said underlying the litany of Africa's development problems is a crisis of governance. And this report was based on collaborative work between World Bank economists as well as African economists and political scientists. And so it represented kind of a new way of thinking about the development problems in the region. Significantly, it came out a couple months before the end of the Cold War, before the Berlin Wall fell. So this was kind of reflecting the accumulated knowledge up to that point. An analogy, maybe a couple years later, in terms of academic research, is Robert Barrow's well-known study of really the beginning of the cross-national growth regression sort of industry, 1991 paper, where he found a significant negative Africa dummy effect when trying to explain economic growth rates throughout the world. So there was this unexplained sort of I think it's about 2% slower growth in sub-Saharan Africa than in other regions than what you would expect given kind of conventional economic variables. So so what a lot of people ended up doing over the next decade or so was to try to plug in governance-related variables that would account for these differences between Africa and the rest of the world. Now, a big part of the emphasis in that literature, because they were trying to kind of do away with the Africa dummy effect, was to find characteristics that were relatively common within sub-Saharan Africa, but not so common elsewhere in the world. So you're basically substituting some variable that's correlated with the Africa dummy in an attempt to drive its effects down. But I think as academics are often a few years behind the times by when their research comes out, it just happened that with the end of the Cold War, we actually saw the biggest kind of divergence of political trajectories in sub-Saharan Africa in quite a while. With the end of the Cold War, you had some countries partly under external pressure moving towards democratization, because by the way, as of 1989, nearly, I think something like 99 out of 100 residents of sub-Saharan Africa were living under authoritarian regimes. Today, it's somewhere around 40%, I think, 40% are living under democratic regimes. So moving from that starting point of essentially, different variations of authoritarian rule, we move to a situation where some countries are moving towards democracy, others are imploding, okay? Others are imploding politically. You have Great Lakes crisis, state collapse, violent conflict in many countries. And then you have some countries that kind of muddle through in various forms of authoritarian rule. So if you look at governance quality today, you actually see that there's huge variation within sub-Saharan Africa. This is what we're going to be trying to explain. The gap between Africa's best and worst governed countries, and on the worst side, it's Somalia, and on the best, it's sort of a cross between Botswana and Mauritius. According to the worldwide governance indicators, the gap in governance quality between those countries is roughly the same as between North and South Korea, which are often taken to be kind of extreme cases. Even more interesting, I think, is that variance in governance quality within sub-Saharan Africa is almost identical to variance among all other low and middle income countries in the world. So we're trying to explain this. I'm going to move quickly here. Two hypotheses that we're going to look at are, and by the way, since we're trying to explain differences within sub-Saharan Africa, we need to look at variables that vary within sub-Saharan Africa, explanatory variables that vary. One is this idea of a political resource curse, which focuses on the impact of lucrative mineral and fuel resources on political institutions, political governance. The resource curse idea, I won't get into too much of the details here, but the idea is that resource-rich countries are less likely to have democratic institutions and more likely to be badly governed than their resource-poor counterparts are. This is an argument about accountability, which is one of the themes of the conference. And basically, the idea is that governments that have access to this easy money from natural resources are able to use kind of targeted patronage as well as repression to avoid accountability. By avoiding accountability, that can mean avoiding democratization, but it can also mean corruption, other kinds of forms of bad governance. Another hypothesis is the idea of a democracy dividend. And again, there's a kind of accountability logic behind this, that if you force governments to be accountable to the public through reasonably open, free and fair elections, you force them to deliver public goods to a broader constituency, so on average you're going to see better development performance. The rest of the presentation is organized in this way, and Alecia is going to take points 1 and 2, and then I'll come back for point 3 and a brief conclusion. The first thing we're going to do is just, that Alecia is going to do is to kind of walk you through the sort of analytical framework, some of the key variables in the analysis, and some of the empirical measures that we use. And then she'll focus on what are the effects of these various variables on whether or not a country has become democratic in the nearly 25 years since the end of the Cold War. So can we predict who's become democratic within sub-Saharan Africa based on information that would have been available around 1990? Then I'll come back and look at how the combination of rents and democracy have affected the quality of governance. So.
Oops. All right. Something that Rod forgot to mention was that the colors of our slides, blue and yellow, we're not really psyching up to University of Michigan, but these are the same colors as our university in Johannesburg.
But you guys got the W upside down because you're in the northern hemisphere, so.
Okay, so my job is to look at the main concepts in our paper and the assumptions about the relationships between them. 5 minutes. All right, these are our main variables. We are interested in explaining how resource rents affect developmental governance. We assume that resource rents are measured in 1990 and they affect democratic institutions and governance quality, and that democratic institutions in turn affect governance. So he has already defined what developmental governance is, so I will not do that again. But what I can explain is that we average the control of corruption and government effectiveness to have an indicator or a combined indicator of developmental governance. With regard to democratic institutions, our preferred measure classifies institutions as democratic if they meet procedural minimum conditions that regarding political openness and competitiveness. So it is a dichotomous measure from 2011 based on Polity 4 component scores. As an alternative measure of democracy, we also use voice and accountability from the 2011 Worldwide Governance Indicators. These are based on the perceptions of the extent to which a country's citizens are able to participate in selecting their government, as well as freedom of expression, freedom of association, and a free media. So resource rents, there's the political resource curse that is out there, that a country's mineral and fuel resources can potentially affect its political institutions and developmental governance. Now, the hypothesis is that, for example, countries that hold that abundant natural resources hinder prospects for democracy and good governance in countries that are resource rich. Now, our definition, as you can see, we haven't really defined what resource rents is, but I can just summarize and say that resource rents are the excess profits from natural resources after accounting for extraction costs and a normal return to capital. So we measure resource rents using data on 14 commodities that account for a large share of mineral and fuel rents worldwide, and this data comes from the World Bank. The original estimates are in current US dollars, which we adjusted for inflation, using the US GDP deflator, and the base year was 2005. We then calculated rents per capita using the working age population from 15 to 64 years old. There is also some literature out there that says, well, if you depend a lot on natural resources, they actually harm your non-rent sector or the other part of your economy. The economic resource curse hypothesis holds that large resource rents can undermine the competitiveness of the rest of the economy. I'm sure you've heard about concepts such as the Dutch disease. We therefore include non-rent income, which is potentially associated with rents. And what we did was we included a double-headed arrow to indicate the possibility of a two-way causation. We also assume that non-rent income can affect democratic institutions and developmental governance. How did we get non-rent income? We used the rent estimates to calculate the non-rent component of national income in GDP minus rents. And then again, we adjusted for inflation using the US GDP deflator. Now, in addition to our main variables that we are interested in, we are also aware that there are other confounding factors that can affect our results. And in this case, we control for deeper historical and geographical concepts. There's a debate out there about the legacy of or the institutional legacy of colonialism. So in this case, countries that had settler economies are predicted to have different outcomes in terms of developmental governance. And also some arguments out there about the British system versus other colonial powers. Some countries, for example, literature says that, well, if you had a lot of disease or bad weather, no one would want to settle in your country. So we also control for those factors. Now, moving to some of our results, here we look at a bivariate association between rents per capita and a dichotomous measure of democratic institutions. What you see here is that you have a lot of countries on the left side, meaning that many countries in sub-Saharan Africa are resource poor, but then there's also diversity in the sense that some are democratic and some are not. Also, you have your resource-rich countries and some diversity there as well. What you have to notice is that countries like Sierra Leone, DRC, and Liberia are countries that had civil wars, so maybe our measure was very lenient in the sense that they made it to be democratic. But to account for the possibility that we incorrectly classified them, we also used a continuous scale of voice and accountability, and we have the same patterns. So what we found was that there is no association between rents and democracy, and we chose to refer to this as the autonomy of the political, in the sense that many other factors don't really explain whether rents predict democracy. So I'll just call Rod to conclude because we have 1 minute.
Okay. All right. So Alicia's taken you through the story of how we get to democratic institutions. Just in conclusion, we want to then look at how this relates to the bigger picture of the quality of governance in these countries. So basically, on the resource rents to democratic institutions arrow, we've got something very close to zero. So we can think about whether you're resource rich or resource poor, whether you're a democracy or a non-democracy as being almost completely independent things. So now we can look at whether there's a difference between how, say, resource-rich democracies and resource-rich non-democracies work. We did a weighted least squares regression, and this graph, it's maybe hard to see the gray bands, but there's uncertainty estimates around each of these lines. But these lines basically give a sense of the general pattern of the relationship between rents and governance quality, which is on the vertical axis, depending on whether you're a democracy or a non-democracy. And we call this the sideways V because we've got a slight upward slope for the democracies, that higher resource rents are actually associated with slightly better quality of governance. But for non-democracies, if you get a lot of revenue from, or if you get a lot of rent revenue from natural resources, your governance quality goes down. So there's a very different pattern between democracies and non-democracies. Another way of thinking about this is that resource rents, in effect, magnify the democracy dividend. At the low levels, we have only small differences between the performance of democracy and non-democracies. As we get higher levels of rents, those lines diverge, and so we can see that effect. I'm just going to jump straight through to the conclusion. This is just an explanation of basically what I just discussed. And then three key findings. One, which Alecia presented, the autonomy of the political. If you take a lot of the variables, sort of structural, socioeconomic variables, institutional variables that people have said help to explain why some countries democratized after 1990 and others didn't, we find very little effect of any of those or combined. So democracy is being driven by something else. We found a conditional political resource curse in the sense that if you lacked democratic institutions, then natural resources lead to worse governance. But if you have democratic institutions in place, if anything, the effect is actually slightly positive, probably close to zero. And the democracy dividend is something that exists. The democracy line is always above the non-democracy line, but they separate as we get into the higher rent economies. So the democracy dividend is actually greater if you're a resource-rich country. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rod and Alence. Our next presenter is Jonathan Ayitey.
So, yes, I'm going to talk about housing provision and finance in developing economies, state policies, interventions, and results. Ghanaian experience. This part of work that I started about 2 years ago, I was trying just to look at mortgage finance in developing economies, and I had the opportunity to come down here, and Anne, Kelly, and Howard, I don't know whether Howard is here, said, no, you can't do this without looking at the political aspect. And since then, the path towards permanent damage to my head has been shifted, and I'm now looking at how politics can affect or have effect on housing provision. So this is actually part of my work. I'm still on it, but have a privilege of presenting what I have so far in this seminar. So this is the agenda. I'm going to look at the introduction, methodology, findings, and maybe flag some lingering issues that need to be considered. So what's the issue? The fact is this: Ghana claim they are the gateway to Africa, though our friends in Nigeria say they are the destination. We have had a lot of improvement over the years. Comparing our gross domestic product with some of the regions around or some of our neighbors shows that we're doing very well. In 2012, it's estimated that we have about 8.2% growth. This has been influenced mainly by oil. And you will notice that when the growth is in resources of the sort, not the mainstay of the economy, which is agriculture, this growth is in very few hands. And yesterday, someone asked, how does this growth appear in the pocket of the common person? As a matter of fact, the result shows that, yes, we are seeing this growth, but what is happening? Now, with this group is political overview. In fact, you will recall that at least Ghana currently is counted to be one of the countries that is on a good political path. We've had about 6 elections since 1992, and the one that a lot of people think is going to crash us never did. Very close elections, but we've been able to go through. So when you look at the political, you look at the economical aspect, you see that things are going very well. But the issue is, how is that affecting housing provision? Are people getting better? We have, the statistics we have shows that out of about 5.5 million households, we have only 3.4 total stock of houses. 51.5% of these households reside in rooms in compound houses. Average population in a house about 7.3, and the housing deficit is expected or estimated to be 1.7 million. So that's not a good story. There has been research, empirical ones, and what they have identified as affecting the housing provision, they talk of lack of long-term finance, land litigations, and ever-increasing cost of construction. But the questions that we are asking here is, what about state policies? How does state policy and intervention affected housing provision over the period? What has been the role of government? Why is there such a huge deficit, and why is the existing housing stock as poor in a country that was once said to be the wealthiest in sub-Saharan Africa? Why? So in attempt of doing this as part of my main work, I take a look, examine the history of housing provision and finance in Ghana since our independence. Decide to forget about the colonial era. We cannot still keep accusing them for the situation that we find ourselves in. So we investigated some of the state interventions, and doing this, I used both primary data and then a secondary one. To get information, I used structured interviews, and I selected the main ministries that are responsible or have a link with housing provision. Ministry of Water, Resources, Works and Housing, local government, land and natural resources, and then finance and economic planning. And secondary data from these institutions also help to really understand what is going on. What are the issues, or how has government intervened since independence? We have had alternating forms of government. The first one, as we know, was a civilian one by Nkrumah. He came in and felt that there should be a socialist approach, protectionist kind of approach. So he proposed to construct 60,000 homes for the poor and then the middle income. So he established a lot of state institutions, and at the end of the day, at the time that they were pushing him out, he was able, out of the 60,000, was able to construct about 11,000 plus houses. Afrifa and his friend Kudoka came in to oust him, and then they plugged the country back into military regime. They were averse to socialist moves, and then they tried to bring in liberalization. What do we have? They unfortunately were not able to add any by way of government provisions to the housing stock that we have. Again, because they were not doing well, we have the bourgeois government, the PP, in 1966 to 1972, also another civilian one. Property-owning democracy, capitalist and market-oriented situation. They established, in the financial aspect, they decide to bring in banks for housing and construction. And the intention of this is to help the individuals to build their own home by creating finance to these people. Unfortunately, the military said no. You can't do that, you're not doing well. So we have these 3 consecutive governments, the National Redemption Council. The name even shows what they are coming to do, redemption. Supreme Military Council, they were supreme. And then they have the first and second. Rawlings said never. So he has the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council. Armed Forces. So what happened? They went back to protectionist system, inward looking. They established a lot of low-cost housing programs. In fact, the first one, the National Redemption Council, has done a bit of good work. It is during their time that they were able to build about 6,000 plus houses. Those from Ghana know of Dansuman, Ashaman, Sakumono, Manhian, Shapatre, and Kumase. These were some of the houses that they brought. However, after Rawlings has tried all that he could in the 1979 coup and wasn't able to get far, he returned the state to civilian rule. There came the PNC, then we have the PNDC, which was again military, then followed by pushing the P away back to NDC, which is also civilian. And it alternates between the civilian, NDC, and NPP. Here is where we have a lot of structural changes. Structural adjustment. Hippie came in. Liberalization moves. Now, turning the whole system into the market system, where the forces of market are expected to allocate housing resources. What was the outcome of it? There has been significant increase in real estate development and housing finance. Housing investment has experienced a boom. Creation of superstar cities started around that time because of the liberalization. Associated with this is worsening affordability issues for the majority poor. Affordable housing came in at a point in time, and the STS, which some people in this room are very much aware of, as a way of affordable housing. So this government tried to blend both social aspect, providing for the middle income and then the low one, with the market system. What has been the result? The outcome. Data that I got from the statistical service and then some of the mortgage institutions shows that the affordability keeps on rather worsening with this liberalization. The upper income tends to have their way, but it will interest you to know that for the poor, using a common measure, housing price with annual income ratios, you spend about 25 years of your gross income to be able to own a bedsitter. And those who are in the middle income, about 9 years. What does this mean? It means that majority of the people can never own homes. And research has shown that majority of Ghanaians cannot own homes. So the government maybe rather have to look at the rental market, how to create the environment for a lot of people rather to rent homes. But as this continues, they rather think also of bringing in the mortgage market. And accessibility to the mortgage market is also not anything to talk about. We have home finance company, Ghana Home Loans, operating currently. But if you look at their mortgage structure, it makes it impossible for a lot of people to even venture into this market. Among other things, you need a down payment of about 30% of the house price. And if a house price is in the neighborhood of $160,000, how can someone who is earning about $870 a year be able to get 30% of this amount? It will take the person the whole of his lifetime. So this is the situation that we have. A lot of people, as I mentioned already, 51.5% are in compound houses. I'll show you very soon what these compound houses are. Then we have a good percentage also dwelling in tents, kiosks, and containers. The issue here is not in rural areas, but we're talking of urban areas, Accra, Kumasi, Takrady, and some of those ones. This is not a good thing to talk about, but that's exactly what is happening. What about amenities in these houses? Over the years, with the government's intervention and things that they keep doing, moving from the socialist system to the capitalist, where they want the market to allocate resources. Very appalling. In urban areas, we can have as high as 15.7% having pit latrines in their houses. And some even have pans and bucket in places like Accra. And those without toilet who use the free range, we know very well that housing is not just the structure, it's services. So these services tells the characteristics of the housing stock. About 12.7 have the free range. And those from Ghana also know what happened, especially along the coast. They don't have these facilities, but they live in structures that are called houses. And these are some of the first one over here, for the vulnerable to be able to survive, they rather tend to do what we call incremental housing. And these are some of the incremental houses that you have in part of Accra and Kumasi. They construct this over a number of years. And before the construction is finished, they decide to start dwelling in them. The one on the left has been there for a number of years, 7 years. And the people are already residing in them. And these are housing. Not that the situation is too bad. Some using the incremental houses have been able to develop the ones down here. But it takes 10 years. These structures have been on construction for about 10 years now. So the issue is, how long are you going to live in this house before you die and go? But that is how the vulnerable in the society, because the market has pushed them away, manage to survive by doing things of the sort. Look at this one, very beautiful. Very beautiful. The land was acquired in 1987. Structure construction was over 18 years. The unfortunate thing is that this is someone who has been working all his life and managed to put up this, stayed in it for 3 years after retirement and then passed on. This at the other side, a second house that has been constructed by an MP, serving his second term in parliament. So the issue is this: you can see the gap between those who are part of the government and then those who are the vulnerable trying to survive. These are the results that we have currently in the country. So if this is the situation, what are we seeing? The free market system has made it very difficult for the majority of Ghanaians to participate in the formal residential market. And as I've already mentioned, Barclay and Matema of the World Bank have observed that Ghana, and currently some of the other cities in Ghana, are exhibiting this superstar city concept. State intervention in housing provision have come in different forms over the years. As already stated, it started with direct provision, other fiscal intervention, support the majority in acquiring their home instead of renting. The policies and intervention over the years have been disjointed, ad hoc, and lack direction. The program were linked with political parties and regimes, and unfortunately, these fade away with their proponents. The affordable housing issue that I mentioned, for instance, for the past 8 years, we have more than 5,000 units that have been constructed, but not completed. But because the proponent of that approach, which is the MPP government, is no more in power, the NDC came and said, no, this is their product, we are not going to touch it. So we have that 5,000 plus there. And they rather decided to go with STC, another affordable housing scheme. And unfortunately, they have to eat the humble pie. It never take off. And that 5,000 is there, wasting, unfortunately. So, liberalization and structural adjustment program embarked upon in the early 80s shifted government focus on housing policy. State intervention gradually shifted from direct provision to creating enabling environment for the market to allocate resources. But unfortunately, these have not been very successful. Through the incremental housing, 45% of Ghanaians can say that they own houses. However, as indicated, this approach is costly through the incremental approach, time-consuming, and lead to unauthorized development. So what is our argument? To attain an appreciable degree of housing accessibility, policymakers need to tailor specific programs towards addressing particular target groups who have been marginalized by the privatization and liberalization with the associated price mechanism, which do not really address the need of the vulnerable and then the poor. So what next? I have to continue with my work. Maybe if I have the opportunity to present again at another conference, then I will complete it and ask, what about the mortgage market? Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Well, from looking at housing in Ghana, we move now southward and look at housing in Angola. Our next presenters are Sylvia, Croese, and Ann Pitcher.
Okay, so our paper is on politics, policy, and housing provision in Luanda, Angola. And here's the overview of what we'll be discussing very briefly today. As many of you know, and as we've discussed today, democratic countries frequently distribute goods such as electricity or water, health care, or education in response to demands by citizens, or in order to buy votes at election time. But why do authoritarian governments do it? I mean, after all, they can repress people if people have demands for particular goods. Or they can manipulate election outcomes. If they're the kind of authoritarian government that bothers with elections, they can manipulate those election outcomes. In fact, that's how they are designated as electoral authoritarian governments often. So why do they even bother to distribute goods? In this paper, we examine the question by looking at the provision of housing by the Angolan government. Most political scientists usually examine public goods such as electricity or healthcare or transport subsidies to make claims about distributive politics. We want to make a case for why academics should focus on housing as well as those other distributive goods that we often focus on. Technically, housing is a merit good because it's not excludable, so it's not technically a public good. But our argument about focusing on housing is that everyone needs shelter. Access to shelter has been linked to better health outcomes in public health research. Housing, obviously, as we all know, is also an asset. It can also be a huge debt. But let's focus on the positive aspects at the moment. Real estate is increasingly a big contributor to GDP in many African countries. Finally, most governments in the developing world make some provision for affordable or social housing. So we think that housing finance and housing provision needs to factor into studies of income and expenditures, also into objective and subjective measures of poverty. So in this paper, we're looking at housing provision in the case of Angola. Angola's been ruled by the same party that assumed power at independence in 1975, the Movement for the Liberation of Angola, or the MPLA. Their rule has not gone unchallenged. In fact, the country only concluded a 27-year civil war in 2002. So it's really been the last 10 years that the government has turned its attention to other challenges in the society. The Civil War, as you can imagine, contributed to many declines in health outcomes and the lack of investment in education and infrastructure, but it also contributed to a huge housing shortage, especially in the capital, where many migrants and many internally displaced persons moved to during the war. So you can see this dramatic increase in the population of the capital, Luanda, between 1985, or 1978 is 3 years after Angola became independent, and then you can see that population shooting up by 2000, and it's even continued to grow after 2000. The fertility rate is about 4%, so that's quite high as well. Angola is a resource-rich country, so it has considerable revenue from the sale of oil, mainly oil, but also diamonds. But it also has extensive social problems and pent-up demand in the areas of health, education, shelter, and infrastructure owing to the war. And like many contemporary authoritarian governments, the ruling party has adopted the trappings of democracy. They have a national assembly. They have regular elections. They have the formal recognition of political rights and civil liberties. And like their more democratic counterparts, they've also sought to distribute goods to sustain the party in power. And housing policy is a central plank in the distribution of goods since 2002, and especially since 2008, when the government pledged to build 1 million houses, and to build these houses before the next election. So there's a political, clearly sort of political motive and objective in the policy. And so our paper's trying to assess the objectives and the effects of the housing policy and its contribution to enhancing government legitimacy. Our key claim is that the quality of housing that's being provided, the location of the housing, and the rights that come with the housing, and the groups to which the housing is being targeted are very much part of a government effort to do what Slater refers to as ordering power, to build particular coalitions of support and to sustain the regime in power. And the idea here is that if the government gives people shelter, then they'll be more inclined to vote for the government. However, our second argument is that because the government actually lacks the capacity fully to implement the policy, it's not really realizing its goal. And we'll sort of talk about the ways in which government efforts to realize this very this sort of highly targeted policy of distributing housing is being undermined by the very people to whom it's directed. So we'll get into the different communities that we've studied, but just to give you an orientation of the research, this is a map of Luanda. Luanda, the province of Luanda is actually broken up into these municipalities, and so those are highlighted here. So we're focusing mainly on Luanda, just to give you a little bit of context for the study, about 75% of the urban population lives in informal settlements. About a third of the population of Angola lives in Luanda province, and 60% of residents don't have access to piped water and electricity. There's a high number of generators and a high number of people who purchase water privately. The majority of the population lives in what the government refers to as inappropriate conditions. Rather than slum upgrading, the emphasis has been on new housing. Approximately 58 new housing projects have been started either by the government or the private sector in the province of Luanda. And we chose 3 of the most high-profile government-driven projects. And when eventually completed, these 3 projects will house approximately 250,000 people. So we chose projects that are meant to resolve housing problems for a high percentage of residents in Luanda. These 3 projects that we chose target 3 different population groups, the poor, public civil servants, and the middle class. And we combined interviews with residents, local officials, architects, urban planners, with site visits and survey research. So I'll hand it over to Sylvia to talk about the projects.
Thanks, Anne. So what I'm going to do is first just give a brief description of each housing project and then talk a bit about a comparison between the 3 projects and our findings and final preliminary conclusion. So the first project is the Zangu project. This housing project was actually the topic of my PhD, so this is really, I've been dreaming and living Zangu for the past 3 years. And it's an interesting project, I think, because I mean, most of the recent housing projects of the Angolan government have drawn a lot of attention, but Zangu was actually the first housing project to be built by the government in the transition to the end of the war. So it started in about 2001, and it was initially aimed to rehouse people who were living in an area close to the port of Luanda, and it was like an informal settlement built on slopes. So after the rains, there had been some landslides, people had died. So initially, the logic was to move these people away from an area that was considered to be unsafe for living. But over time, actually, the housing project just expanded also to include people who were living in other areas of the city that were targeted for redevelopment under the National Reconstruction Program. So at the moment in Zangu, so this is the type of houses, there are about 30,000 units and an estimated 120 to 200,000 people living in Zangu. And as you can see physically, the type of housing, it's actually similar to those from South Africa, the RDP housing. So it's single-story, semi-detached houses. And so largely the population here, or the targeted population, are generally people who are coming from informal settlements of the city, so generally poor people. So the next housing project that we're looking at is called Nova Vida. And this project was created in around 2004-05. They started building, and it was aimed at civil servants, like Anne said. And in terms of the typology of the houses, it's either these kind of 4-story apartment buildings, and there's also an area where there are detached single houses, vivendas. And once completed, there's now a second phase that is currently under construction. It is expected to house about 30,000 people in 6,000 units. The third housing project is the Kilamba housing project, which I don't know, maybe some of you might have heard about. There was a lot of, I have to really, okay. There was a lot of negative attention actually about this project in the international press, as initially when it was built, it was kind of empty, and so people were calling it a ghost city, because this project is actually very huge. It's built by a Chinese contractor, and when it's finished, it is expected to house it is expected to have 20,000 units and expected to house about 100,000 middle-class type of residents. So with regard to our findings, what we are finding is that what is happening in post-war in Angola is, in spite of Angola being an authoritarian regime, housing is actually being delivered. But what is happening is that what we're seeing in terms of the type of houses that is being constructed is that there seems to be a differentiated kind of approach, separating the rich from the poor. As we've seen, like the first houses in Zangu is the kind of RDP houses, like more like the traditional way of living, whereas the civil servants and the middle class are expected to live in what is considered to be more modern type of housing, high-rise, and it's kind of this urban modernist type of feel about it. And then in terms of the approach, I mean, there is a lot of focus on the construction of housing, but there does not seem to be an integrated approach in terms of city planning and development. So while houses are being built, services and infrastructures are still a big problem. So even people who are living in these new housing projects still have the same problems as people who are living in the city when it comes to the provision of water, electricity, but also services as health and education. And another interesting finding is that what is happening is that even though the government is building, this is something that I found very clearly in Zangu, is that actually the distributive benefits of this type of constructions are being captured by the emergence of an informal housing market. So in my own research in Zangu, I found that even though people actually do not receive title deeds, and this links to also the discussion we had earlier, in spite of people not having title deeds, there's a very lively informal market in terms of renting out and selling the houses that are received by the government free of charge. So even though the government is actually investing a lot of money in these housing projects, it seems to leak away through these kind of informal mechanisms. And then the last finding is that actually, in spite of this massive construction that is taking place in Luanda, this does not seem to be translating into more support for the regime. So we try to have two graphs coming up and then the final conclusion, Chair. Okay. So what we try to do, and this is all kind of preliminary, tentative work, but we're trying to establish a relation between the municipalities where the government has built more houses and where there has been less construction. And we see that, and then we try to link them to the voting outcomes at the level of the municipalities. And even though, so we can say that the municipalities where most construction has taken place, which is the Luanda and municipality, they are still kind of average in terms of outcome. So it's not like they are excessively, or the majority is voting for the ruling party, but it's also not very low. But what is interesting is that actually the two municipalities where the government has built less, or virtually nothing, which is two peripheral municipalities, Kisama and Ikoli-Bengu, the voting outcome is actually highest of the entire province. So there seems to be, what we could say there is that it seems to be that that there's not a direct link between the government actually building houses and then people supporting the government when they go when they vote. And And in fact, just something to point out is that actually, because there's this literature that that suggests that the government or governments, when they distribute these type of goods, that they will try to focus on strategic or particular core constituents, which in the case of Angola would be the capital. So you can see that most of the investment has been in Luanda, since it's considered to be a strategic constituency for the ruling party. But when we look at the national level, at the voting outcomes, we can see that actually the support on the national level has been lowest in Luanda, where actually the government has done most to try to give something back to the population. So that's also an important thing to point out. Then when we try to also make this connection to linking the vote to particular groups of the population, we've looked at land values. So there, if you would say that where land values are highest, so you would say that maybe richer people are living there, or maybe people who are more connected to the regime, there seems to be no link with actually higher support for the ruling party. So you can see where the land value is highest would be like the yellow, orange, and red areas. And you compare those to the green areas, which are much lower values, you can see that actually in the greener areas there is much more support for the ruling party. So that's another thing we wanted to point out. So if we come to the final conclusion, it seems to be the case, at least for the case of Angola, that authoritarian regimes do deliver. They are not entirely predatory. But if we want to use the term that was used by the first presenters, this issue of developmental governance, it seems to be that, that their capacity seems to not allow them to effectively implement these policies, which leads to their subversion by the beneficiaries. And then the second part of the conclusion would be that they do deliver, but they do not deliver more than needed to stay in power. So they might build houses, but this is not accompanied by the entire the developmental spectrum of services that would come along with that. But if we would want to look further at this, we need additional survey research to establish a more clear link between the distribution of goods, such as housing, voting behavior, and eventually also government accountability. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Sylvia and Anne. Now we move back across the pond and invite Amy Krings to present on behalf of her co-authors.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Amy Krings. I'm a doctoral student here at the U of M in social work and political science. I think the first question I should address is, why am I on this panel? Seeing as though the talk is about planning, participation, and power, the struggle for the soul of Detroit. Well, I think Anne especially heard about this paper. I was presenting it for an American politics workshop in the department, and there was, the first day of the conference involved a tour of Detroit, and I think the idea was to try to ground some of these issues with development, inequality, provision of goods and services in a comparative American context. So my understanding of my role today is just to present some of the very preliminary work that my co-authors and I have started about a plan that will that aims to set a course for goods and service provision in Detroit over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And we can think about and talk about to what degree it overlaps with some of the other findings of the panelists. So today I'm going to talk to you about a study on power and participation in a local setting, in this case Detroit. We situate our work in a conversation about the new regime in urban politics. In other words, assessments of who decides and how does this determine who wins and who loses. So we have conducted a study looking at who gets a seat at the at the decision table, whose voices are heard, and how does this influence if or how decisions are implemented. To answer some of these questions, we draw from an in-depth case study of something called the Detroit Works Project, which was a planning process that took place during 2010 and 2011, and the content of which was released in a final report called Detroit Future City. That report was released to the public this past January. So of course, our findings are very preliminary. So we study more the process of the planning rather than the outcomes. So first, our paper begins with an assumption that participation matters. Participation in governance matters to three groups: to participants who, by participating, are able to gather new information and new understanding, and ideally to influence outcomes by articulating their concerns. Participation also matters to planners. When citizens who are impacted by a policy come forth, or when that happens, they can provide substantive and useful information. They can increase the legitimacy of the plan, and that can lead to long-term compliance and lesser enforcement costs. And by having participation between citizens and government officials, it can lead to long-term mutual trust and respect. And then also there are just normative beliefs that participation is important, that it's part of democracy. In Detroit, I really appreciated Brian Min's intro where he said we're transitioning from a democracy to an autocracy in Detroit, but in Detroit they say it is still a democracy, and if you're in a democracy that assumes citizen participation and influence over outcomes. And there's also just among democratic theorists an idea about the right to the city, meaning that people should have local control over the spaces where they live. But not all engagement is true participation. Some of you might be familiar with Shelley Arnstein's 1969 piece about ladders of participation, where she demonstrates how sometimes people are participated rather than participating in decision making. And so how she explains that is she says there's a critical difference between going through the empty ritual of participation and having the real power needed to affect the outcome of the process. Participation without redistribution of power is an empty and frustrating process for the powerless. It allows the power holders to claim that all sides were considered, but makes it possible for only some of those sides to benefit. So, of course, we know that sometimes there are incentives by the local governing regime to shape public sentiment, to serve its own private purposes, or to channel participation into largely ineffective modalities, or to co-opt leaders. And sometimes this can advantage the resource-rich over the resource-poor, with resources being money, social status, articulateness, and so on. So we do not assume that opportunities for citizen influence materialize automatically. And when engagement does not include citizen interests and outcomes, then descriptions of participation as a sham can be fair. So we wanted to assess to what degree participation was true participation in the Detroit Works process. And again, remembering that depending on the roles of the policy-making process, certain advantages can be systematically advantaged, while other interests are systematically disadvantaged. Race and class figure prominently in how power plays out in American cities, especially in Detroit. So we wanted to pay particular attention to race and to class. I won't go too greatly in depth into the background on the city of Detroit because so many of you participated in the tour, but I think main things to understand for this paper is that the city of Detroit started losing population back in the early 1950s. Since 1950, it's lost 62% of its population, and that number is expected to continue to fall. More than 2/3 of its residents live in poverty. Around 50% of people are unemployed. 27% of the city's housing units are vacant. There's roughly 20 square miles of land that is vacant. And with that vacancy, it leads to challenges with maintenance and blight. Very common, very common story in a lot of Detroit neighborhoods is that as soon as someone moves out of a house, whether from foreclosure or maybe a death in the family, very quickly scrappers move in and either steal out the copper or sometimes burn the house first, which can make it easier to get the copper out. So decline can happen very, very rapidly. In addition, there have been two types of emergency managers in the city. In 2009, Detroit schools went under emergency governance, and in 2013, the city did. And right now, it's going through a city bankruptcy, which is the largest in American municipal history. Having said all of these sad facts, sad and true, we saw on the tour how much strength is still in Detroit in terms of people who are very proud of their communities, their thriving community organizations. There's a lot of social and economic capital. And we should remember that still more than 700,000 people live in the city. So even though it is shrinking, it is also still a large city. And these problems result from many factors, including the decline of the auto industry, structural and interpersonal racism, incompetent or political leadership, the cycle of poverty, and so on. One policy I think is useful for people who aren't from the United States, that's an example of structural racism, was a phenomenon called redlining. So back in the 50s, the Federal Housing Administration would determine what areas could receive federal loans using a formula, and part of that formula included racial composition. So if there was a certain number of people of color, they would not receive loans. So if in effect, what ended up happening is there was a structural incentive for white people to move to all white neighborhoods outside of the city. And meanwhile, black people were not eligible for loans to maintain or purchase homes in the same way. So there's a history of both policy and interpersonal racism within Detroit. And so the Detroit Works Plan aims to address these chronic needs by coming to terms with these problems. And basically the logic of the Detroit Works Plan is that because the city is so large geographically and its number of residents has shrunk so much, it cannot maintain all of the streets, all of the sewers, all of the street lights, and all of the city functions that it once did. So it's going to need to scale back. And essentially, it's going through a process that they term planned shrinkage, with the idea being by concentrating people in select areas and reverting the rest of the city to woodland, grassland, and other types of agriculture, this will improve the quality of life for all. But this will require relocating people and stopping services to some areas. In 2010, this is sort of the story of the case. Mayor Bing launched the Detroit Works Project. In doing so, he introduced a 13-person steering committee that would be housed under a nonprofit quasi-governmental organization called the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation. Private and philanthropic funding supported the Detroit Works Project, primarily these two very large foundations, Croese and Kellogg. So right off the top, I want to emphasize that this was not the city council, and the mayor was giving his power over to these quasi-economic groups that were foundation-based. In 2011, two distinct projects were unveiled. One that emphasized short-term investments in what were called demonstration areas, and meanwhile, a long-term plan started. I'll explain what happened. this first round, called Detroit Works Project, failed pretty miserably pretty quickly. And so it was unveiled again later in 2011. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The plan in 2010 failed, and in 2011 it was unveiled, and that was the second round. Hopefully that wasn't confusing. Here's an image from Detroit Works of their decision-making structure. This is their description. So I just want to show at the top, it has the city and DGC, that's the quasi-economic group. There are a number of private entities in the middle area, and community is at the bottom. It's in very big font. Repeatedly, we were told community was the foundation of everything, but nonetheless, they are at the bottom of the decision-making structure. Okay. I'm running out of time. I really like talking about this. If people want to talk at lunch, we can talk more. Just briefly, as I said, we were doing a qualitative case study. Our data came from interviews. The one thing I would like to emphasize, though, in terms of methods, is just to say that my advisor, Greg Markus, who's the lead author on this paper, he has been working and doing community organizing in Detroit for more than 20 years. He does organizing in soup kitchens, but around building power and registering people to vote and working on issues ranging from the soup kitchens to the city. And I've been doing organizing in Detroit. 10 years ago, I worked there for a while and then have been back doing my dissertation fieldwork for the last 3 years. So this project came out of concerns that we felt really resonated with redlining. We felt like this was a new type of redlining, and we felt like people weren't talking about it in that way. It was being unveiled as a plan to save the city. So I just want to say we came at this out of some concerns that emerged on the ground. Wrapping up our findings, we found that the Detroit Works project in its final report have offered largely symbolic, limited, and ineffective roles for citizens. One example, when it was first unveiled, there were 5 public meetings facilitated by planners from Harvard who were seen as outsiders, and everyone in the room was given a clicker, and you were allowed to vote, but here are the types of questions you were asked. They were grounded in the assumptions that the city needed to shrink. So you could vote, okay, everybody, would you rather have trash pickup or good policing? Go. Okay, so, all right. And now, do you want schools for your kids or do you want parks for your kids? Okay, good. And so people felt very angry and frustrated that they were being participated and not participating. And people started not using their clickers and getting angry. And that's why Detroit Works 1 was set aside. Later, they hired someone to do civic engagement who stated that 161,000 people were engaged, 31,000 of whom took part in meaningful engagement. But when attending Detroit Works planning meetings, oftentimes what that looked like is you would get a card that would say, here are 10 ways to be involved with the Detroit Works plan. And they were very evangelical. So it was like, invite us to your block party so we can tell everyone on your block how good Detroit Works plan is. Invite us to your church so we can do the same. We'll give you our literature and you can pass it out to your friends. So again, it was like more of an informing, to put it kindly, than any type of dialogue. And counter discourse was ignored or steered elsewhere. I won't read this quote in the interest of time, but it's a person who served higher up in the planning process who said even she didn't feel like she had access in shaping outcomes. It was the Detroit Economic Group that shaped most of the outcomes. And that was a real problem for her credibility to endorse this plan when she felt like she didn't really have a sense of where this plan was going. As a result, the quality of the plan suffered. We saw during our tour how much people have been working so hard to improve their communities in a context of a shrinking city for a long time. There's a lot of grassroots knowledge and experience that could have been brought into the table in a more meaningful way. And we think that we think that the plan is not as strong as it could be because of that. We also worry that there's a codification of services in the form of two cities. If you're in the areas that have been clearly marked as receiving services in the future versus those that have been clearly marked as not receiving services in the future. And that is a plan and a framework for the future the emergency manager has said he'll follow. And it's already happening in terms of the foundation saying we're not going to invest in certain areas, but we will invest in others. And the city saying they will not invest in housing or housing maintenance in certain areas. If a house catches on fire in one of the areas that will not receive services, the idea will be to contain the fire rather than prevent it from burning down. So the types of services are clearly demarcated and on the basis of density, which is very highly correlated with both race and class in the city of Detroit. We also have concerns about governance without government, and especially in cities that are shrinking, more and more responsibilities that were typically held in public agencies being held in private agencies, and what that means for citizens to be able to exert influence over the decisions that impact their lives. Last, we want to say it doesn't have to be this way, and sometimes it isn't. There are a number of examples. The group we met with at Don Bosco Hall said that they follow a model based on the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which was based on people who live in the area forming a plan. So that's one example. There's a similar group on the Lower East Side of Detroit that's doing more community-based planning. And with that, I think I will close.